Entendi. Como isso?
Ela relaciona dança através da genética. Mais articulada.
Welcome to the Wording Dances podcast, a lecture series by dance artists who have something to say about what they do. I am your host, Carlos Oliveira, and this is a co-production between Victor Cordon Studios and Parasita Association in Lisbon. Wording Dances presents a series of episodes, both in English and Portuguese, where renowned artists from the international contemporary dance scene discuss matters which make of dancing and choreographing an inexhaustible terrain of experimentation, problematization, and thinking. Today, we invited Jonathan Burrows to read from a couple of texts which he wrote in recent years and which were also compiled in a book published by Varamo Press in 2022 with the title Writing Dance. He is also the author of a choreographer's handbook published by Routledge in 2010 and currently an associate professor at the Center for Dance Research at Coventry University. Jonathan Burrows is a choreographer whose main focus is an ongoing body of pieces made with composer Matteo Fargion, with whom he continues to perform around the world. We will now listen to Jonathan for about 30 minutes, after which he and I will discuss a bit about the relationship between writing and dancing. So please let yourself tune into the listening and enjoy the words.
Rhythm. 1. The subject of this talk is rhythm, and the talk is written, so we hear the rhythm. 2. Contemporary dance values being in the moment, but in the moment depends on what came before and what follows after, without which we can't interpret the present. We might begin by noticing, for instance, the other times happening while I speak, like remembering what you did this morning, thinking about what could happen next, and wondering when this talk will end. Or where you will go when it finishes, how hungry you are, and what you might eat. Or the time you think this talk should take, and what you would say if you were talking yourself, and whether I'm too fast, or too slow, or too boring, and what boring might mean, and whether the boring is good boring or bad boring. Or the time on the phone in your pocket that you check and then immediately forget, and so on, which is a list of ideas about time, but also a kind of rhythm. 3. I was sitting in a studio with the photographer Hugo Glendinning, and we'd been trying to make sense of a video sequence. And by chance in desperation, we adjusted the music by a fraction of a second, and meaning appeared from this random decision, and it was immediately obvious and unarguable. And we'd moved the music several times before, and it was never right, and then it was right. But what does right mean? And I thought, this is what I have to say when I talk about rhythm, but I didn't know what had happened. I didn't know what had happened, and I wasn't satisfied to call it intuition, though at some level it was. Jacques Derrida wrote that rhythm haunts our tradition without ever reaching the centre, moderating from the edge of awareness, but in itself having no particular meaning. And this mediating rhythm is everywhere. 4. Rhythm creates differences which carry information, and the things that repeat mark out what is different. Rhythm sets the status quo and at the same time subverts itself so that information appears. And the patterns make the information, makes the patterns. 5. When the performance doors close, time gets unreliable, so slow things seem quick or fast things pass slowly. And we're trying to work out where we are in the gap between start and finish, and we long for the ending. Gallery time, meanwhile, is the slice of a constant cake, which has no start or end, allowing us to come and go without measurement, but we measure it anyway. And all the while the chanting continues, good boring, bad boring, good boring, bad boring. Or as the dancer Elizabeth Loeffler pointed out, every performing body has a different duration, and the time it takes her to climb slowly out of her wheelchair might be boring to you, but she finds it pretty interesting. 6. I avoided work this morning by playing English folk tunes. I've always done it, and it's a kind of art, but also somehow outside all that, and I won't mention it again. I do it because I like to sit with others, maybe 15 of us, trying to play music, suffering moments of euphoria when the right tune follows the right tune at the right speed, keeping the pace down low. After 2 hours, the understanding gets stronger, and we don't talk much, giving up self into a field of other, and rhythm is the common property. 7. Metronomes were invented in the 9th century by the Muslim scholar Abbas ibn Firnas, who has a crater named after him on the dark side of the moon. Some people like metronomes and some people don't, and the ones who don't think they make music mechanical, and the ones who do enjoy how they slow things down. Sometimes knowing where the beat is a good way to escape it. Every popular dance has its own speed. The pace of the music tells the body what to do, but the best dance lives in the gap between the beats. And the longer you keep dancing, the stronger the feeling gets, and you're totally there, but at the same time you're giving it all away, to the pulse and to the people around you. 8. Every experience has a rhythm which sinks into the motor memory. Every dancer knows how the traces of old times survive at muscular level to interfere with and alter everything new they try to do. Every member of an audience has a stored bank of rhythm which shapes and alters their responses. Stored memories of rhythmic actions, rhythms of childhood speech and accent, books read, movie sequences, popular songs, advertising slogans, family photographs, paintings, city maps, train rides, sleeping patterns, eating patterns, old apartments, embodied staircases, neighbourhood walks, and all the other overlapped unstoppable mapped rhythms and numbers that matter, like myself aged 62, living at 71 Valence Road, with 3 children aged 10, 12 and 42, a mother who died at 76 and a father at 91, and so on and on. How a child repeats things or watches the same movie is not an obsessive or simplistic acting out, but the slow learning of consciousness, catching itself in the moment of remembering. The way my father tried to anchor his dementia by fluently translating road signs into Morse code, which he'd learned 70 years before. 9. Making a performance is about getting from one thing to the next in a convincing manner, then going on doing that for a while until a continuity happens, which we might call rhythm, and then waiting for that continuity to give you permission to deviate. And it's all duration, whether long or short. 10. Sometimes you have to forget about rhythm to arrive back at rhythm. Like the harpsichordist Robert Hill playing Bach's Goldberg variations with the instruction that his left hand steal time from his right. Or Tom Waits asking his band to play like a beautiful train crash. Or Alvin Lucia's music performance called I Am Sitting in a Room, in which he recorded the same text over and over until the language disappeared in a gentle howl of feedback. And a slight stutter he made in the first recording repeats again and again until the words are eaten, but we can still hear the stutter beneath the howl, like the ghost of his original mistake. Traces. At some point, we began to speak of the body as archive when it finally got recognised that dancers carry their library with them, but what a mess the library turned out to be. The choreographer Joe Moran said, the quality of dance is that it's fantastically unstable. There's always a lot going on under the surface, which makes it hard to pin down. Choreography techniques and concepts try to hold dance somewhere so that we might read it, but it's only ever half the story. Every now and then I practice a kind of dancing in my living room with some Joan Skinner instructions to help me keep my hands off what I'm doing for long enough that I keep doing it. I'm trying to notice what my archive is throwing up, and it's like shining a torch into fog. Then this morning I had a thought that this thing where I lift my arm belongs to the dancer Dennis Greenwood. It always has. Every time I do it, it's his. But if you do it, it's something else and someone else's. And if you watch me do it, you neither know nor care whose it is. It's just another familiar movement. For me, it's like a taste in my mouth. Usually when that kind of habit rears up in the fog, I swerve to avoid it. And the swerve triggers the start of another well-known movement stored in my archive from some past dance, so I swerve again. The map I carry has the attractions marked, but I like the back roads and wilderness, where the path curls around and you're suddenly somewhere else, and there are no signs, or the signs are faded. So I don't always know what's in the archive, or only by the shape of its absence, because I'm avoiding a movement, or momentarily lost. I let in the arm that belongs to Dennis, but mostly I dance in the gaps between. And the wilderness has a taste, and you can taste it when you watch it, but eventually a bit of wilderness gets too familiar, so I start trying another path round about that area, and my negotiation with the shifting patterns has a taste. I chose the word taste to describe the sensory quality of a movement because I don't have another word for it, but it's the wrong word. Pattern is the wrong word for what happens between my motor cortex and the world into which I move. Motor is the wrong word for my movement. Skinner releasing technique says an idea changes everything, so when you're moving and this becomes that, then a new world is formed. Or for the composer Karlheinz Stockhausen, a moment is forming. And one moment overlaps with another moment or other moments, but there comes a tipping point when a change has happened and we're somewhere else, or something like that. We're somewhere else, and mostly it's a place without a name, but place is the wrong word for it because it's moving. The sensory cortex tracks it and the motor cortex recognizes it eventually, and it starts to pass into the non-conscious until the next time a moment occurs, which may or may not be the same moment. And the motor cortex throws up old stuff to help me with new stuff, so nothing is untainted by history. But history is the wrong word for it because it's activating here and now, and the body makes no judgments about time. Research is probably the wrong word to describe what it means to shine a torch into all this fog. Whenever I dance, I'm confronted by who I used to want to be, and the future wishes I had for myself return as memory, and I wrestle with them. The desire to strip dance back to a disinterested mode is born partly out of a refusal to succumb to this overwhelming sense of lost and wished-for self, that floods us when we dance. The mass of barely readable emotions, flickering references, wild sensitivity of skin, this stumbling we call gravity, and the self-consciousness. To dance is to absent-mindedly trace relationships that amount to something which might mean something but are quickly wiped away, or something like that. The meaning is just the recognition of a something that isn't the previous something, and that changes everything and also nothing. And the signs and reference and representations are weaker than we want, so we invented choreography to freeze-frame them, but it never quite works, which is why we keep on working. I'm trying to think what this motor cortex looks like, and a black box flight recorder is the obvious image, but completely wrong. It's not a box, and there are no patterns. The logic of it resides all over me, and I recognize things I'm doing which I never did. I only saw them in photographs or films. The movement memory is hardwired, but there is no wire, and there are no memories. And the idea that we never forget how to ride a bike is useful, but there is no bike. Each pattern that isn't a pattern seems to trigger more recognition of more patterns, which gets confusing, but my body isn't confused. And the subjectivity is embarrassing, but potent. I have route maps of current and past pain that tell me where to go and what to avoid. I have route maps of past failure that I have to argue with daily. I lay on the bed just now and thought myself a ballet without moving, and the synapse is fired and it was clear as day, though I haven't crossed the floor jumping for a long while. And drunk dancing at a wedding is unstable, but the logic of it is also encoded somewhere. Every pattern is the continuation of that slow embodiment which never ends, shifting in relation to each and every new situation, and there is no fixed copy on a shelf in your mind. You can grasp or try to commodify dance, but its instability outwits everyone, as it wobbles its way sideways to somewhere else, equally tenuous and resistant and hard to sell, which is maybe why everyone wants a bit of what we've got. History. History looks like a straight line, but my body disagrees. There's stuff in my motor memory that still thinks it's 1978, and my body's not good with dates, or aesthetic arguments, or what's in or out of fashion. I'm trying to work out how to approach dance history without academic certainty, and at the same time without nostalgia. But I need the thought of the academy to keep me steady, because body memory is wobbly, and nostalgia comes and goes, as always. This talk is pretty much subjective, for want of a clear picture, and to see what my body might think about history in relation to future, if I risked to ask it. And it turns out I have a lot of steps in me going way back, and some of them are in fashion and some of them are not, but my body is remarkably unprejudiced against these patterns and throws them up, old against new. It's a hard-hearted art form when it comes down to it, and you think how long it takes to learn choreography, and how fast it loses the context that gave it meaning, and then seeing how far ahead that stuff will sit in your muscles. And you're on your deathbed, and your legs are still thinking about sub-Cunningham dance routines. Judson, for my generation in the UK, was contact and release techniques, the women's movement and improvisation, and back then nobody here talked much about Yvonne Rayner's Trio A. To watch Trio A, you had to wait in line at the New York Public Library and be passed a pneumatic videotape through a hole in the wall, which you watched with headphones on in front of a TV set in a crowded public room. It was so exotic. Meanwhile, a lot of what passed into our bodies came through a kind of osmosis that flowed from dancer to dancer, and everything seemed possible and unburdened by historical proof. I went to the Dartington Festival in England in 1980 or 1981, and I ended up by accident in a recreation Steve Paxton made of his 1967 pedestrian piece, Satisfying Lover. And it never occurred to any of us we were walking through an icon. It was just something we shared in a workshop festival, and he liked the ones who laughed, because embarrassed laughter seemed a more straightforward response. And afterwards there was a disco. In the 1980s, Judson was just the recent past that had opened a gate, and the future hadn't yet been pinned to any kind of historical past-perfect moment. Our body-mind doesn't work like that. It's a more anarchic thing, really, and won't be held down by hierarchies of knowledge. We're more like the movement equivalent of those TV programs about people who hoard junk, and mostly we don't want it tidied. And even if we did, there's no disentangling Trisha Brown from a Michael Jackson video, because motor memory sorts according to movement similarities, which is a curse and a blessing and the source of our work. Ramsay Burt talks about Judson Church's disinterested mode of performance, which he says is still a dominant mode, and I know what he means and what it feels like. And I got to noticing recently when I use it and when I don't. And I use it mostly when I feel I should be more contemporary. As in contemporary dance, which has been contemporary for the past 50 years, making it slightly hard for us to locate the present, let alone what happened before or the opportunities ahead. At the same time, my performing self recalls other ways to engage and suggests them to me with quiet resolution and as an act of resistance against the idea that the contemporary could be so easily represented by a particular kind of walk. Because sometimes things just feel more fierce or funny. Contemporary dance is all the time busy calibrating what the body throws up, which process excludes many people and practices, but long may they conquer, regardless of that construct called the contemporary. It's hard to see why anyone would want less. This is subjective, this is a mess, because that's how the past 50 years have felt on a cellular level, which is our great strength and a blessing, however hard it might be to figure out what's really going on. Robert Cohan, dancer with Martha Graham and founder of London's first modern dance company, came to watch a rehearsal of his old dancers, and as he left he turned to me and said, This is a room full of people who still think dance has meaning. And I looked, and he was right, and I wasn't quite sure what to make of all that. And the possibility that dance might have meaning still hovers at cellular level, or at least one might say that many of us experience an occasional moment of guilty expression that rises like a ghost and must be contextualized. I don't believe in the moment, but I'd hate to see the cult of archiving sit down like an elephant on our pragmatic forgetfulness. And I'd hate to see the machine of social media make us stupidly forgetful, so we can only tolerate what happens in a day and must throw everything else immediately away, including ourselves and our friends and the work that we love and need. I started writing a list of all the dance artists still alive and still making work, whose work I love and need. And it got longer and longer, and I kept writing, and I was going to read it out to you, and I was going to end the list with the ones I missed, saying you, and you, and you, and you, and you, and you, and you. Some of them were making work 50 years ago, but they don't feel like history, not at a cellular level. The human body hasn't changed much in the past 200,000 years, which is a pretty special place from which to resist all that. And everything is new at the point of performance if you want it to be. It's an ecological imperative, really, to honour the history in our bodies and leave room for the ambiguities that emerge and the swerves. Because history goes sideways in the body and overlaps itself and more or less ignores fashion or the official timeline. This is a ramble in the woods with a guide who can't see the wood for the trees, and every tree is always almost somewhere, which is the best place to be. We're always almost somewhere, and the best pieces never quite arrive, leaving us thinking ahead to what might happen next. Leaving us thinking ahead to what might happen next, and never more than in a 4-hour performance, or a 24-hour performance, or a 24-minute performance. We're always almost somewhere slowly, and the best pieces never quite arrive, but remain imminent, which is where I leave you, present now, but passing through, in all directions. Thank you.
This was Jonathan Burrows reading from Rhythm, Traces, and History, 3 different texts written between 2015 and 17, and recently published by Varamo Press in the book Writing Dance. Thank you so much, Jonathan, for this text, and I would like to start by asking you how the practice of writing exists in relation to the practice of dancing and also of choreographing in your artistic work. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Yes. I mean, the first thing I wanted to be clear about is that many dancers don't connect dancing and writing because of the danger of that the connection places the specific limitations of language upon dance itself. So it's not a generic thing, it's not a universal thing to be thinking of dance in terms of language or the written. But there are many people, of course, drawing from written text and from language. For me, I started reading poetry when I was a teenager, and I've always had this strong sense that there's a connection between writing poetry and choreographing, and it's to do with the way that both use rhythm and form to condense and amplify images and connections. and both of them use forms of syntax to clarify meaning. So in terms of dance, syntax would be those decisions you make while you're dancing or choreographing, which are about pausing or connecting or relating in time that can completely alter the feeling of what's happening. And I mean, the other thing to say is that I'm in my 60s, so I dance less, and I have found that writing is an outlet for similar impulses and imaginations that I feel when I dance. So it is partly to do with where I'm at in my own life that I'm writing more.
I'm just recalling that at a certain moment in your text, you talk about how writing in relation to dancing is somehow always in deficit, never being fully able to grasp the depth and the complexity of what happens in the very moment of dancing. But further on, you also say that you don't really believe in the moment. And then you say this very intriguing thing, which is that you hate to see the cult of archiving sit down like an elephant on our pragmatic forgetfulness. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you see this relationship between memory and forgetfulness. And is there any way for this relationship to be a generative one, perhaps going from sitting, as in sitting like an elephant, into moving?
Yes, my interest in the idea of undoing the construct of in the moment was triggered by hearing the Bulgarian philosopher Boyan Manchev speak. And he did this beautiful talk where he unpacked the multiple times happening in any given performance. And I found it extremely liberating, even though if I perform, I still walk on and try to be in the moment. Nevertheless, it's very important to be reminded that it is just a construct. And the other thing to say about forgetfulness is that what I'm describing is that dance is quite unusual in that, unlike music or literature, dance has never really found a workable notation system. Now we have digital means to constantly record, but still there is not quite a library. We don't live in the constant presence of the history of dance. Jerome Bell, very early on in the kind of arrival of YouTube, said, at last, this is our library. But then, in fact, two things happened. What you could find on YouTube started to be taken off again for copyright reasons. And secondly, there ended up so much stuff on YouTube that it still doesn't function like a library. And that's it's a strange paradox for dance, because on the one hand, we do literally work in an eternal present. It's very easy to lose track of what happened before. And on the other hand, I quite like that quality. It means that a young person can work a little bit free. The other thing I wanted to say about that is that I have recently, with the Serbian dramaturge Bojana Švejić, been researching ways in which cognitive philosophy and also neuroscience have been looking at the ways in which memorized sequenced movement through the world has a direct impact upon perception, and particularly to do with the ways that what has been remembered by movement through the world constantly triggers anticipation of what might be encountered. And this is another aspect of memory to do with bodily knowledge, accumulated bodily knowledge, that I find very fascinating. And I see in that an analogy with what happens when you choreograph, that choreography for the performer and the audience is this delightful playground of recognizing and anticipating constantly. And that, again, connects to rhythm and syntax.
So coming back to this practice of writing and to what you just read to us, how do you see that the synthetic requirement of writing brings you to create concepts and deal with specific terms and terminologies that would otherwise not be there or just not be defined as such?
Yes. 13 years ago or so, I wrote a book called A Choreographer's Handbook. And the premise of that book was that I would explore and I would hopefully facilitate other people to explore choreography, but only ever through questions. So the majority of the book of A Choreographer's Handbook is a series of questions. This is what I observe. What do you observe? Or this is what I would do. What would you do? And after that book had been published, I began to give a series of talks in different places, and I decided that I had had enough of this process of questioning, and that in the talks that I would give, I would take the risk to try to discuss and try to language those aspects of dance and of choreography and of performance, which I have heard people try to language many times in workshops. So the text that I just read came from this second book, which is called Writing Dance. And Writing Dance is full of attempts to say what essentially is too complex to say. So I wouldn't say that the book arrives at a series of usable concepts. I think the book inevitably and quite consciously fails, but it does reflect what I have experienced and what I love, and which I think is part of contemporary dance practice, and in fact part of all dance practice, which is the constant attempt to articulate that which is very difficult to capture. It's difficult to capture because the body is multiple, always. So you select one thing, you lose all of the other things. And ultimately, the only way to experience it is to dance. But I thought I would take the risk anyway, and the risk was a pleasure. And that's why I mentioned poetry, because I was guided in some way by poetry, because of the way that good poetry is always trying to articulate something that is difficult to articulate. Or the Irish poet Seamus Heaney described it as that he wrote poetry to arrive somewhere he could not reasonably have expected to arrive, but which he recognizes when he gets there. And I was very much following that principle.
Well, that brings me to a last question I would like to make you, which is, after all this time doing dances and choreographing, are there specific problems that persist in the doing of choreography?
Yes, the fundamental paradox of me asking you to watch me dance is that that's not what human beings do. Human beings join in a dance. And I think if you're performing in any dance context, it's really important to constantly remind yourself of that. And I think the people talk about contemporary dance as being a difficult art form, or there's a smaller audience for it, and all of that is true. But the reality that I keep trying to share with people that I've experienced is that the paradox that it's difficult to do because ultimately you want to join in means that a lot of the time it doesn't work. But when it does work, it has an almost miraculous quality that I don't experience from quite in the same way from any other art form. And the quality is one of a very strong feeling, a presence, which appears to be meaning, but is actually premised upon things which you're not able to articulate in your mind. And in fact, a great performance, and I write this in the book, a great performance never explains itself. It finishes and it remains imminent. So the engine of it continues turning in you when you leave the theatre. Other than that, of course, the recent pandemic had a very powerful effect on dance and dance performance, and I'm really enjoying it. And the effect to me, as far as I read it, and I think I'm hearing from other people, is that it allowed a greater respect for all of the ways in which dancers practice, and not just performance. Performance took a back seat. It didn't exist for a year and a half or 2 years. And I've started to really love the ways that dancers talk together, dance together, share together. And these activities and relationships are not always evident. So they don't always arrive as data that somebody can count and say this is important. But it seems powerful, and there's people all over the world get tuned into it. And I find that interesting. It gives me hope.
Thank you so much, Jonathan, for this conversation and for sharing your thoughts and your texts.
Thank you, Carlos.
I would also like to thank Stephen Smith, who helped us recording this episode in London. We will soon publish some new installments in this lecture series, so if you wish to know more about the up-and-coming releases, please follow Victor Cordon Studios and Parasita Association on social media, websites and streaming platforms. I would also like to thank you for being there, listening, and I hope you can join us in the following episodes. Thank you so much.
Entendi como isso. Ela relaciona dança através da genética. Mais articulado.